Hello, Comrade Joe.
Yes,
Hello, how are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. And you?
Can you hear me, Comrade Joe?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Your audio is not on, I suppose. I cannot hear you.
Let me see. See, how's that?
I still cannot hear you. I can see you though. I cannot hear you.
You cannot hear me at all, or the audio is not good?
Still no audio.
No audio, huh?
Can you hear me?
Now? Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We still can't get audio this side. We can't hear you.
That's very strange.
Okay. It was my audio. Comrade Joe. Comrade Joe. I can hear you now. It was on my side. I think we just lost him there. We just rebuild this and we'll be back in a few minutes. Sorry about that. Can you hear me? You're on mute. Unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Brilliant. We apologize. We apologize for that. Some difficulties.
I don't know what that was. I'm very sorry.
No. It's more common. It's more common than not. If you can just tilt your device, because you're in landscape, you can just tilt your device.
Sure.
Oh, that is fine. That is better. That is better. Yes, welcome everybody to another webinar episode of Africa for Palestine. Today our host is Joe Catron. I hope I'm pronouncing it right. Joe Catron is an activist, an international solidarity activist based in the United States, and he's also a freelance writer for many other publications, international publications as well. We host these webinars weekly throughout the month of July, August, and the coming month to kind of raise awareness, to educate ourselves, and to educate our audience as well on recent events, what's happening in Palestine, what's happening globally. But before we get into it, I'll just give our audience a short journey of who we are. Africa for Palestine, it's a solidarity organization based in South Africa, but does work in the African continent and abroad. We work with organizations that have a similar mandate as ours, so religious organizations, churches, mosques, trade union movements, political parties, broader civil society organizations, governments as well, who identify with our cause, and that's the Palestinian cause. primarily another task that we are primarily occupied with is pushing the Israeli influence out of the African continent and giving solidarity to Palestinians in Palestine and abroad. Welcome, Comrade Joe. We've been waiting to have this webinar. Are you fine?
Yes.
Wonderful. Comrade Joe, let's get into it. Can you just please tell the audience about yourself and the work that you do?
Sure. Well, I'm based in New York City, where I work with a number of groups in support of Palestine. Most directly, I'm the U.S. coordinator of Samadun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, which, of course, organizes, as you might guess from the name, primarily in support of prisoners, although more broadly for Palestine as well. We've coordinated two recent global actions on July 1st and then August 7th through 9th, both of which I believe Africa for Palestine supported. And within New York City, Samadun also works with a number of other organizations. We're in the similarly named NY for Palestine Coalition, and we work with its member groups, Al Auda, New York, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, within our lifetime, American Muslims for Palestine. So yes, we are involved in a great number of things here. Unfortunately, it's been hard to find our footing during the coronavirus pandemic. I know that's been the case everywhere. I imagine without having followed it so closely, it may be similar there as well. But we're starting to come out of that now. Our last 2 days of action here have been very impressive. So I'm optimistic looking forward.
Thank you for the brief introduction of yourself, Comrade Joe. For our viewers who are not aware, Joe spent considerable time living in Gaza. Can you please tell us about that experience of being a foreigner in Gaza, an activist as well in Gaza?
Certainly. Well, Gaza over time, if you stay there long enough, is a wide range of experiences. It's really a mix. There are lots of times, weeks and months, when it's very quiet and not much is happening. And then, of course, there are times when it seems like everything is happening at once. I was there for the last 2 Israeli offensives in 2012 and 2014, as well as for the relatively quiet period in between. Although even during what seem like the quiet periods, if you follow the news, there's constant Israeli aggression, airstrikes, attacks on farmers and fishermen, encroachments to bulldoze land. But for the most part, it's, how can I even generalize about it? It's so many things. It's just a very friendly, welcoming place. If you ever have the opportunity to go, I highly recommend it. I don't think there's any hospitality in the world quite like Palestinian hospitality.
Yes, if there's something Palestinians are known of worldwide, is great hospitality, and great food.
Yes.
Tell us about the topic we're discussing today is the rise of and the growth of Palestine activism in the United States. Do you believe that it is because of, like you said, the relentless offensive, the relentless oppression by Israel on Palestinians, that in the United States people are starting to realize, but this is the oppressor, this is the oppressed, we need to stand with the oppressed? Or do you believe that it's because of the great work that activists do on the ground? Or is it a combination of both?
I'd like to take some credit, but honestly, I'm not convinced that we have that much to do with it. The best that we can really hope to do is channel public opinion as it's being shaped by events on the ground in Palestine into something productive and to organize meaningful solidarity with Palestinians for the liberation of Palestine. At times, it can be much easier to convince people here of the justness of the Palestinian cause than it can be to build meaningful activities that shift the balance of power more in favor of Palestinians, which is certainly our key task here in the United States, Israel's primary international sponsor. But certainly the struggles of Palestinians on the ground are the key thing, and the thing that makes whatever relatively minor accomplishments we reach here possible. I really feel like 2018 was something of a turning point. Both the Great Return March, the spectacle of Israel gunning down dozens, ultimately hundreds of unarmed demonstrators, was something that very few Zionists here were really eager to explain or excuse. And at that point, we stopped hearing from a lot of them. And of course, while it wasn't as significant in the grand scheme of things, the imprisonment and trial of Ahed Tamimi also that year, I suppose beginning at the end of the previous year, 2017, but mostly in 2018, that brought a lot of attention and a lot of people to the cause. And we've been building since then. But I would say that whatever we've achieved here, whatever we've accomplished, is due entirely to the struggles of Palestinians on the ground. And I'm not even sure, I wouldn't go so far as to say that we've done as much in light of those struggles as we could have or should have. At times, our organizing capacity, our ability to channel this energy in productive directions has been very weak, too weak to take advantage of the opportunities that were available for us. So it's certainly something that we're considering, how we can develop most effectively moving forward to make it possible for everyone, for the growing vast numbers of people here who are in solidarity with Palestine, to take action, because that's the key thing.
Interesting that you say it's events on the ground in Palestine. We've seen in the past that mainstream media has not been able to shift public opinion towards the Palestinian cause. Do you think social media plays an important role in getting what's happening in Palestine on the ground to U.S. citizens, to activists in the U.S. that can ultimately join the solidarity movement?
Mainstream media is a very mixed bag, particularly here. Yours, I believe, is somewhat better. But in the United States, it's overwhelmingly Zionist in tone. You'll rarely see an article or report in any mainstream outlet that isn't heavily slanted in favor of Israel. At the same time, sometimes we do have to rely on it for information. It can simply be the fastest at getting news out from Palestine to let us know what's happening. So in that sense, it can be important. And at times, it's simply pretty impossible for them to obfuscate or to hide or to spin what's happening, as in the case of the Great March of Return. They could try as hard as they wanted to, and there were some pretty spectacular efforts, but there was no way over the course of that multi-year ongoing massacre to possibly make Israel look good. It simply couldn't be done. So in that case, simply the fact that they were spreading information was somehow helpful at times.
All right.
But I should add, because I don't want to leave this out, we also have very good, favorable media here who are dedicated to Palestine and strongly in favor of it, and report at least equally well, even if they don't always report on the same things. We have outlets like Electronic Intifada and Mondo Weiss, who do unbelievable work at propagating news and perspectives as well, much more than the mainstream from the ground. So we don't have to rely exclusively on the mainstream, thankfully. We would be much worse off if we did.
Yes, I was saying earlier on that we've seen, particularly with the Great March of Return, how social media plays a role in giving first-hand information of what's happening on the ground. You do not have to get it from a third party, The killing of the journalist in 2018, was it? Was widely publicized through social media, and the killing of the medical worker in the Great. So, social media does play a role, or does it play a role in influencing US-based citizen US activists?
I'm sorry, would you repeat the last part of that question?
I'm saying that social media, the information, that first-hand information from social media also influence how United States citizens, United States activists approach the Palestinian question.
Certainly, social media plays an indispensable role for many of us. Perhaps some, you might say some of us even spend too much time on it, but it's a very good way to understand quickly what's going on. Certainly whenever there's an airstrike in Gaza, for example, or an arrest campaign in the West Bank, we'll most often see it first on Twitter before it's reported anywhere else. There are at times problems with misinformation. This will be an issue whenever you have large numbers of people contributing information with little quality control. But for the most part, I would say that its most valuable role is in building connections between people here and people in Palestine, giving us an opportunity to actually get to know each other, because I'm sure you found there as well, that's what movements are really built upon. It's not just about knowing facts. I could know all the facts in the world, but if I don't have some actual reason to do something about them, it's not going to mean much. So that, I think, has been the single most important thing about social media and the Palestine movement, giving people personal connections.
We believe so as well. For us at Africa for Palestine, organizations like Quds Network really do bring out that raw kind of connection between us and them on social media. Even before your mainstream media, even in South Africa and in the African continent, can grasp it. So we also use it a lot. Interestingly, we know that the biggest support in the world for Israel is in the United States. We know that the Israeli lobby in the United States via IPEC and others is very, very, very strong. But amidst this, Palestine activism does persist, and it's very interesting to see. Just recently, Ilhan Omar just got re-elected into Congress, and 3 other congresswomen got elected who are openly Palestine supporters, who are openly supporters of the BDS movement. What do you think contributes to this persistence in Palestine advocacy work in the US, given the environment of Israeli influence?
Well, I have to say again, first, that the primary cause is, of course, the struggle of people on the ground, people seeing that and reacting to it. Beyond that, there are ways in which the dynamics of the United States, like those of South Africa, make many people here naturally sympathetic to Palestine, our history and our realities today. One of the most overwhelmingly pro-Palestine movements within the United States is the Black Liberation Movement, which has always been really at the forefront politically of forging that path of support for Palestinians and their struggle. And the same is true of the Native, Chicano, and other liberation movements within the United States. At the same time, the United States has a settler colonial history and presence, of course. Many people are in some way predisposed to be favorable to that, which is a blow against us. That's something that we have to push and work and organize against. So we have very conflicting historical trends here, and those are manifested in the various positions you'll find on the Palestinian national movement. But we're doing what we can, and I have great hope for the future. I would like to think, at least, that the reactionary tendencies I mention are losing steam. And it does seem to be happening, although perhaps not quite as quickly as some of us would like.
We've seen in the recent past also the intersectionality of struggles. The Black Lives Matter movement also saying our oppression is Palestinian oppression, Jewish voices for peace. So those organizations are coming together on many other different causes, but including the Palestinian cause. We see this growing in the United States. Do you see it even going further? Do you see many other organizations saying, for instance, we are dealing with the issue of Native Americans, but also we sympathize with the Palestinians?
Well, we certainly see aspects of that. You mentioned Native Americans. One of the strongest groups in support of the Palestinian struggle right now, is the Red Nation, which is a Native revolutionary group based in the southwestern part of the United States. Historically, the American Indian movement and similar groups have been very strongly supportive of Palestine. There was a great deal of support for Palestine at Standing Rock, which was a historic moment for all of us, I think, in ways that we haven't quite understood yet. It was really the first time in over a generation that kind of Native mobilization had come together within the United States. And really the first time, perhaps, that it enjoyed such broad support from society as a whole. So the fact that Palestine was represented and a part of that was something very important. So yes, it's something that we've seen here and are continuing to see, and I'm very hopeful that it will grow.
And you've definitely had some victories in the recent past. We just mentioned that a number of Palestine supporting Congress people have been elected, and Palestinian congresswoman has been elected as well. Walk us through some of the other victories that you have scored as the product of that movement in the United States.
Well, certainly the elections of open BDS supporters to Congress is remarkable. Some of the victories of BDS campaigns themselves, like the G4S campaign, in which I believe both our organizations were heavily involved, or the Orange campaign, are quite noteworthy and worth celebrating as well. But within the United States, I believe our biggest victory to date has been, it's hard to figure out how to explain it, a shift in the tone. Like, it's becoming much less of an assumption than it used to be that people here will be Zionists or in any way favorably disposed to support Israel. And in many circles, it's becoming simply unthinkable to be a Zionist. This is just something you don't do. It's like being an open white supremacist. I mean, the two are basically the same, but that isn't historically how it's been thought of here. And that's the most exciting development, really, that I see going on right now. And it's something that, as I said, will be a challenge for us to build on. Again, we don't always have the organizational infrastructure in place to make it possible for people to struggle just because they are in support. Our key task is turning passive supporters into active supporters.
Definitely. I think historically speaking, we were able to do that in South Africa as well. From the 1970s going to the 1980s, it was no longer nice to associate with apartheid South Africa, because apartheid South Africa was well defended in the West. They had tight relations, but because of the growing anti-apartheid movement and the achievements and strides they made, it became not so fashionable to associate yourself anymore. And we've done it in the African continent. If you remember, there was something called an Africa-Israel Summit that was supposed to take place, I think, in 2018, if I'm not mistaken. And because of the work that activists do in the continent, African leaders, even those who are selling out to the Israeli regime, by the way, cannot afford to publicly be seen as Israel supporters. So I think it's a very good building block to build on in the United States. And we know historically it's a campaign that works, and all the West.
And this isn't in any way comparable in scale, but some of the most exciting victories here in recent years have been by students whose organizations, the student unions at their universities, have publicly distanced themselves from Israel and called for their universities to divest or end exchange agreements with Israeli universities. And this has happened at certainly more than I can count. Brown University and New York University spring to mind as recent examples, but it's a sign, I think, of how much Israel is losing the next generation. There are some older people who perhaps will always support it, or perhaps not. We should hope. But among younger generations, it's those who are in university now and recent graduates, it's much less expected and also much less acceptable than it used to be.
And much more informed. I mean, the generations to come cannot claim ignorance. They are much more aware, they are much more informed because of what activists do in the ground, that Israel is an apartheid state. You support it, you don't support it. Those are the facts that you should know.
Repeat that, I'm sorry.
I was just saying, generations who are coming, I'm agreeing with you, the generations who are coming from now on, even though they support Israel, they would know that I support Israel, but I know it's an apartheid oppressive state. They are much more aware than the generations before us.
Right, and certainly that's one positive result of the media economy we have now. There's so much information, it's really impossible for anyone to actively deny basic facts about the Nakba, for example, the ethnic cleansing of 1948, or the massacre during the Great Return March. People may not have heard of these things, but if they try to argue about them, they'll quickly find themselves presented with the actual information because it's so readily available. So that's one way in which the media we have now, the vast array of resources, work very much in our favor, I think.
Speaking of the media, Comrade Joe, you yourself have written in several publications in the Palestinian question, internationally and local as well in the United States. You published a book as well. Tell us, interestingly, how is the freedom of speech and freedom of press as it relates to the Palestinian question? We had a United States guest during our Israeli Apartheid Week in 2018, and she was surprised about how we say Israeli apartheid on our mainstream media, on our public broadcast. She was genuinely very surprised that it's not normal in the US to say apartheid Israel on the media. So just tell us how is freedom of press? How is it often that I can open my local newspaper and see an opinion piece about Palestine? Am I welcomed as an analyst on Middle East if I support Palestine? How is that freedom of press, freedom of association, freedom of speech as it relates to the Palestinian question in the US?
Well, we have a saying here, the press is free if you own one. And we're really seeing two contradictory trends in the media. There's the ongoing conglomeration of media. We have massive corporations buying up huge chunks of it at a time. So control of it is being concentrated in smaller numbers of hands constantly. At the same time, we have the growth of new media, social media, alternative media. So those who want to seek it out aren't necessarily as restricted in what information is available to them, but in many cases they do have to seek it out. And of course, alternative media isn't necessarily good. A lot of it is simply junk. So in that sense, you do have to be aware of what you're looking at and do your own research. Our freedom of speech, our First Amendment, the part of our Constitution guaranteeing ostensibly the right to speak, worship, assemble, is pretty good. In many ways, it's the strongest protections for speech as speech in the world. But at the same time, we constantly see enemies of Palestine in particular seeking ways around it, seeking to repress the speech of their enemies. We've seen, for example, academics, Stephen Saleta is one glaring example, penalized, in his case fired, for speaking out in support of Palestine. And now the Trump administration is seeking to abuse, of all things, our civil rights laws, believe it or not. He wants to use our civil rights laws to protect Zionists at universities from criticism. Now, I don't personally think that's going to get very far because of the First Amendment. I could be wrong. But these are all very real considerations for us here. At the same time, it's often exaggerated. If you read the headlines, you might get an idea that there's a level of political repression of supporters of Palestine here that simply doesn't exist. For the most part, we can say and do and gather as we like. So in that sense, the First Amendment is working out very well for us. But as I said, it's not absolute. And the enemies are always seeking ways around it.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for letting us pick your brain on activism in the US.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
And lastly, for many other activists in the audience in the African continent, other parts of the world, and specifically the US, for activists who are dealing with animal rights, for activists who are dealing with sexual violence and so on, those who would like to get into the intersectional kind of struggles of the world and interested in getting to Palestine work, what would you say to them?
I would say simply organize. I mean, that's, I think, our key task everywhere right now. Find an organization, whether it's Samadoun or Africa for Palestine, whatever it is in your part of the world, find one that suits you and build with it. Because at least here, I don't know if it's exactly the same there, but public sentiment is moving rapidly in our favor. We just have to do something with it. So it's very simple for us, at least.
Thank you very much for that message. So we are on the right side of history. We are the team to join. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you for your time. For those who want to interact with Joe Mohi, is on Twitter, he is on Facebook, and he's very active on Twitter, I must say. So he answers questions, he responds to queries. So if you have questions, you'll find him there. And thank you once more, Joe.
Thank you.
Goodbye.